you issue a written decree, a law of the Persian and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order the Queen Vashti to be forever banished from the presence of the King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. The king and the nobles thought this. And he moved her and made her maid into the best place in the harem. As a result of the king decree, Esther, along with many the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of the Hamadite, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of the Exodus. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There's a certain race of people scattered throughout all the province of Empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the law of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they are destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administration to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hamadite, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." So on April 17th, the king's secretary was summoned, and the decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officials, the governors of the respective province, and the nobles of each province in their own script and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews will be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all people so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. When Mordecai learned all about what had been done, he tore his clothes, put on burlap ashes, and went out into the city, crying with a loud, bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothing of mourning. And as news of the king's decree reached all the province, there was great mourning among the Jews. They fast, weep, and wailed, and many people lie in burlap and ashes. When Queen Esther's maid and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, she was deeply distressed. She sent clothing to him to replace the burlap, but he refused it. Then Esther sent for Habitat, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed as her attendant. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was troubling him and why he was in mourning. So Habitat went out to Mordecai in the square in front of the palace gate. Mordecai told him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Habitat a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all Jews. He asked Habitat to show it to Esther and to explain the situation to her. He also asked Habitat to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Habitat returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Habitat to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the province know that anyone who appears before the king in this inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. and the king has not called for me to come in for 30 days. So Habakkuk gave Esther's message to Mordecai. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. Then Esther sent the reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. On the 3rd day of the fast, Esther put on her royal robe and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, he welcomed her and held out the gold scepter to her. So Esther approached and touched the end of the scepter. Then the king asked her, What do you want, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it shall be half of the kingdom. And Esther replied, If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for the king. The king turned to his attendants and said, Tell Haman to come quickly to a banquet, as Esther has requested. So the king and Haman went to Esther's banquet. And while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, Now tell me, what do you really want? What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom. Esther replied, This is my request, my deepest wish. If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I ask, please come with Haman tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for you. Then I will explain what this is all about. Haman was a happy man as he left the banquet, but when he saw Mordecai sitting at the palace gate, not standing up or trembling nervously before him, Haman became furious. However, he restrained himself and went on home. Then Haman gathered together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and boasted to them about his great wealth and his many children. He bragged about the honor the king had given him and how he had been promoted over all the other nobles and officials. Then Haman added, And that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us, and she has invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, But this is all worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew just sitting there at the palace gate. So Haman's wife, Zeresh, and all his friends suggested, Set up a sharpened pole that stands 70 feet tall, and in the morning, ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. When this is done, you can go on your merry way to the banquet with the king. This pleased Haman, and he ordered the pole set up. That night the king had trouble sleeping, so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so it could be read to him. In those records he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthan and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the doors to the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King X. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendant replied, Nothing has been done for him. Who is it? Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on a pole he had prepared. So the attendant replied to the king, Haman is out in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in. The king said, What should we do to honor a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, Whom would the king wish to honor more than me? So he replied, If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head. Let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robe. and lead through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go. This is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robe and my horse and do just as you have said to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. So Haman took the royal robe and the horse and dressed Mordecai and left him on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, this is what shall be done for the man whom the king desires to honor. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the palace gate, but Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. Haman returned to his own house, mourning and with his hand covered in sorrow. Then Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that happened to him. Then his wise counselors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall in status, is of Jewish heritage, you will not overcome him, but will certainly fall before him. While they were still speaking with him, the king's eunuchs' attendants arrived and hurriedly brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank their wine, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done. Then Queen Esther replied, if I found favor in your sight, O king, and if I please the king, let my life be spared as my petition, and my people be spared as my request. For we have been sold, I and my family, to be destroyed, killed and ripped out of existence. Now if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for our hardship would have been sufficient to burden the king by even mentioning it. Then King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who dares to do such a thing? Esther said, an adversary and an enemy is Haman, this evil man. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Then in his fury, the king stood up from drinking wine and went into the palace garden to decide what he should do. Then the king said, will he even attempt to assault the queen with me in the palace? As the king spoke these words, the servant covered Haman's face in preparation for execution. Then Hammers, one of the eunuchs serving the king, said, now look, there are gallons 50 feet high. Then Hammers, one of the eunuchs serving the king, said, now look, there are gallons 50 feet high, standing at Haman's house, which Haman made for Mordecai, whose good warning saved the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger subsided. On that day, King Xerxes gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai became the king because Esther had disclosed what relation he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther put Mordecai in charge of the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king and fell down at his feet and wept and implored him to avert the evil plot of Haman the Agagite and this plan which he had devised against the Jews, because the decree to annihilate the Jews was still in effect. Then the king held out Esther the golden scepter. So Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter is proper in the king's view, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hamagite, the Agagite, which he wrote, in order to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's province. For how can I endure to see the tragedy that will happen to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he stretched out his hand against the Jews. Also concerning the Jews, write as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a decree which is written in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, may not be revoked. So the king, also concerning the Jews, write as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for a decree which is written in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring, may not be revoked. So the king's scribes were called at this time in the 3rd month. This is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and it was written in accordance with everything that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews, to the chief rulers, and the governors and officials of the province, which extend from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province in its own strip, and to every people in their own language, and to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by carriers on horseback, riding on the royal horse, the offsprings of the racing monarch. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate at the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both the children and the women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day in all the province of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all people, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemy. The couriers who rode on royal horses went out hasting and pressing on by the king's command. The decree was issued in Shushan, the city. Then Mordecai departed from the presence of the king in royal apparel in blue and white, with a large crown of gold, and with a robe of fine linen and purple wool. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced, for the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And each and every province and each and every city, wherever the king command and his decree arrived, the Jews celebrated with gladness and joy, a feast and a holiday, and many amongst the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews and their God had fallen on them. So on March 7th, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's province to attack anyone who tried to harm them, but no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the province, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout the province as he became more and more powerful. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They had destroyed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews annihilated 500 men. They also annihilated the 10 sons of Haman, sons of the Hamathite, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not take any plunder. On that day, the number of those who were destroyed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's province? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, Let it be granted to the Jews who are in Sushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Sushan. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Sushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons.